Imagine walking into a modern mega grocery store.
Right. The kind with massive aisles.
Exactly. You stand in the cereal aisle, and you have like 40 different options.
Hmm?
You have fresh produce flown in from 3 different continents, and it's available in the dead of winter.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It really is. You can scan your items, tap a piece of plastic to a machine, and just walk out.
Oh,
It feels like this triumph of human coordination. I mean, it feels like pure, unadulterated freedom.
it does.
But then you step out the automatic doors,
Hmm.
and you might see someone sleeping on the pavement right next to a luxury condo building, a building they might have even helped construct, but could, never dream of living in.
Yeah, that stark contrast.
Right, that jarring contrast, the sheer abundance sitting side by side with profound deprivation. That is the beating heart of our deep dive today. We are tackling a question that shapes nearly every single aspect of your daily life, even the parts you don't realize are being shaped.
Oh, absolutely.
We are asking, is capitalism compatible with justice?
It is, hands down, the defining economic and philosophical question of the modern era. And it is incredibly loaded.
Oh, for sure.
The moment you put the words capitalism and justice in the same sentence, you are touching a raw nerve for a lot of people. Because this isn't just a debate about, how we calculate GDP or manage interest rate.
Right, it's way deeper than that.
Exactly. This is a debate about the architecture of human society itself.
And before we get into the weeds, let's just establish the mission for today's dive into the source material. We are unpacking an incredibly rich stack of research, historical observations, and, well, philosophical arguments.
And we should be clear, we aren't picking a side here.
No, not at all. The goal is to look at the underlying logic of these arguments impartially. We are putting both the defense and the critique under a microscope to understand the mechanisms, like how they work and why they compel so many people.
Because today's sources aren't just asking if capitalism makes us richer.
Right.
They're asking what kind of human order does this economic engine create? And critically, is that order morally just?
And the stakes here are not abstract, are they?
Not even a little bit. We aren't doing a detached academic thought experiment here. The way a society answers this question dictates your experience of work.
It dictates pretty much everything.
It really does. It dictates class structure, political power, and how wealth moves across generations. It determines how a society allocates its most vital resources.
Like who gets access to a safe home.
Yes, who gets a home, who gets life-saving health care, who gets a high-quality education. And on an even deeper psychological level, this system shapes how people measure their own self-worth and how they value the people around them.
It is literally the water we swim in. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can debate whether this system is just or unjust, we have to define the beast.
We need a clear definition. Yeah.
Because the word capitalism gets thrown around constantly. It's used as a badge of honor, and it's used as a devastating insult. But it rarely comes with a strict mechanical definition.
Which is where our source material is incredibly helpful, because it lays out 5 specific structural pillars. If a society is going to be called capitalist, it generally relies on these 5 load-bearing walls. First up, most productive assets are privately owned.
Let me stop you there, because I think there's a common misconception here. When we say private property, we aren't talking about, like, your toothbrush or your personal laptop, right?
No, the distinction is crucial. We are talking about the means of production.
Okay, meaning what, exactly?
The factories, the massive tracts of land, the server farms, the proprietary software algorithms, the heavy machinery. In a capitalist system, these wealth-generating assets belong to private individuals, private corporations, or shareholders.
So not to the state and not to the public collectively.
Exactly. They are held privately.
Got it. So pillar 1 is the private ownership of productive assets.
Pillar 2 is that markets play the dominant role in allocating goods and labor. Think about how complex a modern economy is.
Millions of transactions a second.
Right. Millions of goods being produced and shipped daily. Instead of a centralized government committee trying to calculate who needs what, or how many shoes to produce, or where people should work.
Which sounds impossible, honestly.
It's highly inefficient. So the system relies on decentralized price signals. Buyers and sellers interact based on their own needs, and those interactions set the prices and the wages.
Which brings us to pillar 3, according to the text, which is competition. And that feels like the engine room of the whole thing.
It is the survival mechanism that forces efficiency. People and firms must compete with one another for customers, for resources, and for labor.
So if you get lazy,
If a company becomes lazy, inefficient, or produces a terrible product, a competitor will ideally step in, offer something better or cheaper, and take their market share.
which naturally leads to pillar 4, the profit motive.
The compass that directs the ship. The primary legally mandated reason a commercial business operates is to generate a return on investment for its owners or shareholders.
Meaning every decision is filtered through that.
Every single one. What to produce, who to hire, where to build, it's all ultimately filtered through the lens of profitability.
And finally, we have pillar 5.
Investment and capital accumulation shape economic life. This is the temporal aspect of capitalism.
Temporal aspect, like dealing with time.
Yeah. Wealth in this system isn't just something you consume, like eating a feast until it's gone. Wealth is turned into capital. It is reinvested into the system to create more wealth.
Oh, I see.
That constant drive for accumulation is what dictates the future direction of economic growth.
So just to recap, we have private ownership, market allocation, competition, the profit motive, and capital accumulation. Those are the base mechanics. But our sources emphasize a really vital caveat here.
A huge caveat.
Right. Capitalism is not a single monolithic thing. It doesn't look the same everywhere you go.
Far from it. It manifests in wildly different forms depending on the political and cultural soil it's planted in.
The way I've been trying to conceptualize this, and let me know if this tracks with the research, is to think of capitalism like a smartphone operating system. Let's call it Market OS.
Okay, I like this.
It's the base code. But the specific version of the operating system a country runs drastically alters the user experience. You have the lightly regulated version, which is almost like a developer mode.
Right, bare bones.
Exactly. Highly volatile, very few safety nets.
Yeah.
Then you have the welfare capitalism version running heavy social safety net apps. You have social democracy running robust labor union apps. Or, you have oligarchic capitalism where the code has been manipulated so only a few elite users have admin privileges.
That analogy tracks perfectly with the institutional view in our sources. The base code, meaning private property, profit, competition, is running in all those scenarios. But the apps, which in reality are the laws, the tax codes, and the regulations, completely change how this system interacts with human beings.
It's a totally different day-to-day reality.
Exactly. And this is why the debate over justice is so difficult. If someone asks, is capitalism just? They might be picturing a highly regulated Scandinavian social democracy.
Right, with universal health care and strong unions.
Yes, while the person arguing with them is picturing a ruthless, unregulated Gilded Age monopoly.
They are essentially arguing about two completely different user experiences, which means to really get to the core of the philosophical question, we have to look at the strongest theoretical arguments that transcend those specific apps. We need to look at the underlying logic of the base code.
Right.
Let's pivot into the defense. Why do so many philosophers, economists, and everyday people look at this profit-driven competitive machinery and see a system that is fundamentally moral?
The defense laid out in our sources rests on three major pillars. You have voluntary exchange, the rewarding of effort and innovation, and the undeniable production of real prosperity.
Okay.
To understand the moral weight of capitalism, we really have to start with the concept of voluntary exchange.
This is the argument about consent, isn't it?
Yes, the morality of choice. The fundamental premise of the capitalist defense is that if two adults freely agree to exchange goods, labor, or services without anyone putting a gun to their head, that transaction is inherently just.
I can definitely see the intuitive appeal of that. Like, if I have a bicycle I don't want and you have $100 and we agree to trade, justice has been served.
Exactly. Neither of us was forced.
We both walked away feeling like we got something better than what we had.
And if you scale that simple bicycle transaction up to an entire global economy, you have the capitalist ideal. From this perspective, the system is deeply moral because it respects human autonomy.
Respects the individual.
Yes, it respects private property, which many view as an extension of one's own self and labor. And it respects the sanctity of a contract. The state is not stepping in to dictate what job you must do, what bread you must buy, or what price you must sell your labor for.
It's treating citizens as autonomous agents capable of making their own decisions. But I imagine defenders of capitalism don't just rest their entire case on the freedom to make a contract. There's also the question of human nature, right? And how the system channels it.
That leads directly into the second core argument, which is incentives. A common critique of capitalism is that it just relies on greed.
You hear that all the time.
Constantly. But the sophisticated defense reframes this entirely. It argues that capitalism doesn't create self-interest. It simply recognizes that self-interest is a biological and human reality.
It's just how we're wired.
Right. And it designs a mechanism to harness that reality for the public good.
Explain the mechanism there. How does self-interest get harnessed for the public good if the primary motive is just making a profit?
Think about it this way. In a truly competitive capitalist market, the only way I can legally get you to give me your money is by offering you something you value more than the money itself.
Okay, makes sense.
I might be entirely selfish. I might only care about getting rich and buying a yacht. But the system forces me to figure out what you need.
I see.
I have to invent a better medical device or write better software or bake a more delicious loaf of bread. Capitalism channels my personal ambition into solving your problems.
That's a really fascinating way to look at it. It aligns the desire for personal gain with practical usefulness to others.
And that alignment creates a powerful sense of moral desert for defenders of the system. The idea that if you take on enormous risks, if you put in grueling hours, or if you create a product that improves millions of lives, you deserve to reap a massive reward.
It's a system that incentivizes innovation,
And supposedly punishes stagnation.
which naturally sets up the third massive pillar of the defense.
Hmm.
The sheer scale of the prosperity it generates. Because, let's be honest, you could design a system that sounds incredibly fair and perfectly equal on a whiteboard.
Sure, in theory.
But if everyone living under it is freezing and starving, it's a failed system.
What's fascinating here is the sheer weight of the historical and empirical evidence defenders bring to the table. When you look at the broad sweep of human history, global wealth and life expectancy were essentially a flat line for millennia.
Nothing really changed.
Right. The vast majority of humanity lived in extreme, grinding poverty. Then, coinciding with the rise of market capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, that line shoots upward like a rocket.
The famous hockey stick graph.
Exactly. We are talking about an explosion of technological progress, the mass production of life-saving medicines, the development of global logistics networks that can move food to famine zones.
The construction of massive infrastructure.
Yes, and a staggering rise in living standards for billions of people.
So the defender's ultimate trump card is basically outcomes. They're saying, look at the scoreboard. A just system has to actually improve the material conditions of humanity, and no system in history has lifted more people out of absolute poverty or generated more abundance than capitalism.
That is the absolute core of the defense. It pairs the moral elegance of voluntary consent with the practical triumph of material abundance. You have freedom, you have fair incentives for hard work, and you have unprecedented prosperity.
It is an incredibly formidable argument. When you lay it out like that, the logic feels, well, it feels tight.
It does.
But as we promised at the start, we are examining the entire architecture of this debate. We have to look at how the critics view the exact same mechanisms, because they look at that very same base code, the property, the markets, the profit motive, and they see a machine that fundamentally undermines justice.
The critique is just as robust as the defense, and the source material highlights three major counterarguments. First, that voluntary exchange is largely an illusion. Second, that wealth inevitably concentrates into domination. And third, that the profit motive actively overrides human needs.
Let's start by dismantling that first defense. The defenders put a massive amount of weight on the idea of voluntary exchange, the bicycle for the $100. How does the critic pull that apart?
The critic introduces the concept of structural inequality, or what is sometimes called the coercion of necessity.
Okay.
The argument is that looking at a contract in isolation ignores the power dynamics of the real world. Let's look at the labor market. On one side, you have an entity, say a large corporation, that owns capital, property, and the means of production.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have an individual who owns nothing but their capacity to perform labor.
So right away, the starting positions are wildly asymmetrical.
Profoundly so. The critic asks, is the worker's choice to take a grueling minimum wage job truly voluntary? Formally, legally, yes. No one is pointing a weapon at them.
Right.
But if the alternative to signing that employment contract is not being able to feed their children, losing their health care, or becoming homeless, the freedom in that transaction is an illusion.
I see. So the critic's argument is essentially that capitalism disguises necessity as choice. If my only options are taking a low-paying job or losing my home, I'm not really making a free choice in the marketplace.
That is the exact mechanism the critic is highlighting. When one party holds all the structural leverage, and the other party is negotiating for their basic survival, the resulting agreement isn't a beautiful expression of mutual freedom.
It's an expression of power.
Yes, the moral language of consent is just acting as a smokescreen for exploitation.
Which naturally leads to the second major critique. If these exchanges are heavily tilted in favor of those who already own capital, what happens over time?
You get the inevitable concentration of wealth and power. The mechanics of capitalism dictate that capital accumulates. Wealth generates more wealth.
It compounds.
Exactly. If you have capital, you can invest it, earn interest, buy up competitors, and leverage economies of scale. But if you only have your labor, your ability to generate wealth is strictly capped by the hours in a day.
The snowball effect, but on a societal level.
And the critic points out that this economic snowball doesn't stay neatly contained inside the economy. Economic power seamlessly translates into political and social power. As wealth concentrates, you see the emergence of class domination.
Because they can use that money.
Right. Those with capital can afford elite education for their children. They can hire lobbyists to write tax laws that favor them. They can fund political campaigns.
They essentially buy access to the levers of society.
Hmm.
Let me pause on that because the defender might say, well, so what? Some people are rich, some are poor, but everyone is richer than they were 200 years ago. Why is that concentration of power fundamentally a justice issue, according to the critics?
Because if a small group of people can dictate the political laws, control the media landscapes, and heavily influence the life chances of everyone else, you no longer have a democracy of equal citizens. You have an oligarchy.
Oh, wow.
If a child born in a wealthy zip code has a statistical guarantee of success, and a child born in a poor zip code has a statistical guarantee of struggle, regardless of their inherent talent or work ethic, the critic argues that the system is actively producing injustice.
It breaks the promise of meritocracy. That makes total sense. Now, let's look at the third critique, which targets the profit motive itself. The defender said the profit motive is great because it forces people to solve problems. What is the counter-argument there?
The counter-argument is that the profit motive only solves problems for people who have purchasing power. It is completely blind to actual human need.
Break that down mechanically. What does that mean in practice?
The market only responds to what economists call effective demand, which means desire backed by cash. Let's look at medical research.
Okay.
A pharmaceutical company operating purely on a profit motive has a massive incentive to develop a hair loss treatment for wealthy men in Western countries. Why? Because that demographic has high purchasing power.
They can afford to pay top dollar for it.
Right. But they have very little incentive to develop a cure for a rare tropical disease that only affects impoverished populations because those people cannot pay for the drug.
The mathematical logic of profit is working perfectly, but the moral outcome is completely warped.
Exactly. The critic points out that what is mathematically profitable is very rarely what is most humanly necessary. This dynamic distorts the allocation of resources.
You end up with weird priorities.
Yes. You end up with a society that is incredibly productive, capable of producing luxury yachts, high-frequency trading algorithms, and endless consumer gadgets, while simultaneously failing to provide affordable housing, accessible health care, or clean water to millions of its citizens. The productive energy of humanity is directed toward the wrong ends.
Okay, we've laid out the architecture of both the defense and the critique. And listening to them back to back is honestly a bit disorienting.
It really is.
When you look at the defense, it seems incredibly logical. When you look at the critique, it seems undeniably true. It feels like these two sides aren't just disagreeing on the facts, they were having two completely different conversations.
They're speaking entirely different philosophical languages. And this is the most crucial insight in our source material. The reason this debate feels endless and intractable is that the defenders and the critics are using entirely different definitions of the word justice.
This is the Rosetta Stone of our deep dive. The sources provide 4 distinct lenses of justice, 4 ways to define what is fair in a society. And the compatibility of capitalism with justice hinges entirely on which lens you decide to look through. Let's spend some real time on this because it clarifies everything.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Lens number 1. Justice as respecting voluntary exchange and property.
This sounds very familiar to the defense we just covered.
It is the bedrock of the defense.
Yeah.
Through this lens, justice is entirely about the process, not the outcome. Think of it like a game of poker.
A game of poker, okay.
As long as the dealer didn't stack the deck and no one was hiding cards up their sleeve, whatever the distribution of chips is at the end of the night is, by definition, fair. Even if one person has all the chips and everyone else is broke.
So if we apply lens 1 to the economy, justice means people own what is legitimately theirs, they trade it freely, and the government doesn't step in to confiscate wealth just to make things equal.
Right. Under Lens 1, attempting to forcefully redistribute wealth to achieve an equal outcome is actually an act of deep injustice because it violates property rights. So if you hold this specific definition of justice, capitalism isn't just compatible with justice, it is the truest expression of it.
But the critics clearly aren't looking through lens 1, they were looking at the outcomes. Let's switch to lens number 2, justice as equal opportunity.
This lens shifts the focus from the rules of the game to the starting line of the race. The argument here is that for a system to be just, everyone must have a genuinely fair chance to succeed based on their own merits and effort, regardless of the circumstances of their birth.
And this is where capitalism starts to face serious friction. Because capitalism, by its very nature, generates unequal outcomes. Which wouldn't be a problem for lens 2, except that the unequal outcomes of one generation become the unequal starting lines of the next generation.
Mechanically, wealth accumulation destroys equal opportunity. The capital amassed by parents buys advantages for their children. It buys access to elite, well-funded schools, while poor neighborhoods have underfunded schools.
It buys tutors.
Tutors, unpaid internships, inherited social networks, and health advantages.
So even if the legal market is totally open, like anyone can legally start a business, the reality is that the starting line is staggeringly unequal. A kid starting a race 10 miles behind the starting line isn't experiencing equal opportunity, no matter how fast they can run.
And therefore, if your definition of justice requires a fair and equal starting line, unregulated capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with it. It constantly reproduces structural inequality.
Let's move to lens number 3, justice as meeting basic needs.
This is a moral floor argument. It argues that before we even begin to worry about the freedom of contract or the fairness of a starting line, a just society has a baseline obligation to ensure the survival and dignity of its members. Justice means no one falls below a certain standard of living.
It means ensuring access to the absolute essentials: food security, safe housing, basic health care, and perhaps dignified conditions of work.
And as we discussed with the critique of the profit motive, capitalism alone is incredibly bad at meeting this standard. Because the market only responds to purchasing power, it will gladly allocate resources to build a fifth vacation home for a billionaire, while ignoring a family that cannot afford a first home.
So, through lens 3, capitalism is severely inadequate. If a system allows citizens to freeze or starve while it simultaneously produces a surplus of luxury goods, it fails the test of justice.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most complex perspective, lens number 4, justice as freedom from domination.
Domination. That's a heavy word. What does it mean in an economic context?
This draws on a very old tradition in political philosophy, often called Republican justice. The core idea is that you cannot be truly free, and a society cannot be truly just if you live at the mercy of someone else's arbitrary power. It explores the vast gulf between formal legal freedom and deep economic dependence.
I'm trying to picture how this works in a modern workplace. I mean, I am legally free. I am not a serf tied to the land. I can quit my job tomorrow. How am I dominated?
Let's look at the mechanics of your employment. Say your health insurance, which pays for your child's life-saving asthma medication, is tied directly to your employer.
Okay.
And your wages are just barely enough to cover your rent, meaning you have no savings buffer. In this scenario, your employer holds an immense amount of dictatorial power over your life.
Because if I upset them, or if I refuse to work unpaid overtime, or if I report a safety violation, they can fire me. And firing me doesn't just mean I lose my income. It means my child loses their medicine and I lose my apartment.
Exactly. The power imbalance is so extreme that you must self-censor, submit to surveillance, and endure indignities just to survive. The employer doesn't need to point a gun at you. Their control over your access to survival goods is a form of domination. Under Lens 4, capitalism creates massive spheres of private, unchecked power. Monopolies dominate small businesses. Landlords dominate desperate tenants. Creditors dominate debtors.
So what does this all mean? It is incredibly clarifying. If you and I are arguing about capitalism, and I think justice means protecting private property, Lens 1, and you think justice means preventing employers from dominating workers, Lens 4, we are never going to agree. The system is perfectly designed to fulfill my definition and perfectly designed to violate yours.
That synthesis hits the nail on the head. The debate isn't actually about the mechanics of the market. It's a profound disagreement about what human beings owe to one another.
And the sources take this even further. They argue that capitalism doesn't just distribute resources or create power dynamics. It actually changes the way we think. It rewires our psychology.
This leads us to what the text calls the deepest critique. The philosophical argument here is that capitalism isn't just an economic machine, it's a meaning-making machine. And its core logic is commodification.
Commodification, turning things into products to be bought and sold.
The critique is that capitalism has an insatiable appetite. It doesn't just want to commodify physical goods like shoes or steel. It constantly pushes its boundaries to price, optimize, and monetize more and more aspects of human existence. It changes our values by changing how we perceive everything it touches.
Let's walk through the specific examples provided in the research, because I think this is where the philosophy becomes viscerally real for a lot of people. The first example, labor becomes merely a cost.
Consider the psychological impact of that classification. In a spreadsheet, human labor is put in the exact same category as the cost of raw materials or electricity. It is an expense that must be minimized to maximize profit.
So the systemic pressure is constantly trying to squeeze more out of the worker for less.
And in doing so, the humanity of the worker is stripped away. They are no longer viewed as a person with dignity, exhaustion limits, or a need for fulfillment. They are a human resource, an input, a depreciating asset. The critique here is that when a society looks at its citizens primarily as inputs to be optimized, it degrades our shared humanity.
That brings us to the second example, housing. The text notes that under capitalism, housing transforms from a shelter into an asset class.
This is a profound shift in purpose. The fundamental human use value of a house is shelter. It is a place to raise a family, a place to sleep safely, an anchor for a local community. But when capitalism commodifies housing, it prioritizes its exchange value. It becomes a speculative financial instrument.
Which explains the modern housing crisis. You have massive private equity firms buying up single-family homes, not to live in them, but to maximize the yield on their investment.
Precisely. The logic of the market dictates that the house exists to generate a return. This leads to absurd and tragic outcomes. You have luxury apartment towers in major cities sitting largely empty because they function as safe deposit boxes for global capital.
While the locals get pushed out.
Yes. Teachers and nurses who actually work in the city are forced into homelessness or extreme commutes because they can't compete with investment capital. The financial logic has completely overridden the human logic.
The third example of commodification is education. The text points out that learning becomes a competitive investment. And frankly, this is so normalized now it's hard to see it as a critique. We constantly talk about the ROI, the return on investment, of a college degree. We tell teenagers they need to pick a major that will pay off.
The fact that it feels so normal is exactly what the critics are pointing at. The market logic has successfully rewired our brains. What is lost when we view education purely as an investment? Education ceases to be about human development. It stops being about civic duty or the pursuit of truth or learning how to think critically.
It just becomes a credentialing arms race. I am buying a piece of paper so I can beat you out for a spot in the labor market.
It monetizes curiosity and turns students into rival investors. Now, look at the fourth example from the text, which feels incredibly urgent today. Attention becomes a marketable resource.
Think about how we track our attention today. We literally call it the attention economy. The apps on our phones are free, but they are built by some of the most valuable companies in the history of the world.
Because the product isn't the app. A product is your focus. In a capitalist system looking for new frontiers to commodify, human attention was discovered to be a deeply valuable resource. So billions of dollars are poured into mapping your psychological vulnerabilities, designing dopamine loops, and keeping you scrolling. Your mental energy, your time, and your focus are harvested, packaged, and sold to advertisers.
They figured out how to put a price tag on human consciousness. This critique suggests we are losing points of our humanity by putting a price tag on things that shouldn't have one. And the final example the text notes is that even care and time become governed by profit logic.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the profound fear driving this critique is that not everything valuable should have a price tag. There are things in human life, care for the elderly, the innocence of childhood, the integrity of the natural environment, the pursuit of art, that are destroyed the moment you subject them to a profit analysis. A truly just society, the critics argue, must have sacred spaces. It must build walls to protect certain aspects of life from the corrosive logic of the market.
This is a heavy, almost spiritual critique of the system. It suggests we are losing parts of our humanity by putting a price tag on things that should never be for sale. But how do defenders of capitalism respond to this commodification and inequality? They aren't blind. They see the inequality, they see the housing crises, they see the commodification. When faced with these realities, what is the ultimate defense? They look at the rules of the game.
Exactly. The defenders look at the board and they argue that the critics are blaming the wrong thing. We can call this the structural defense. The defenders argue that the harms we just discussed, monopoly, extreme poverty, political capture, do not emanate from the concept of free markets themselves. They emanate from bad institutions.
I see. So they are saying, don't blame the game itself, blame the referees who are letting people cheat.
That is the exact argument. The defender says that capitalism isn't a force of nature that inevitably destroys justice. It is a tool. And unjust outcomes happen because the specific version of capitalism a country is running has weak regulations, allows corruption, and fails to enforce the rules.
Let's run through this mechanically, using the specific institutional solutions the text provides. The critic says, capitalism creates exploitative labor conditions where workers are dominated by their bosses. How does the defender solve that without abandoning capitalism?
The solution isn't to dismantle the market. The solution is robust labor law. You establish a minimum wage so the coercion of necessity is softened. You enforce strict workplace safety standards. And you legally protect the right of workers to form unions, which allows them to bargain collectively, rebalancing the power dynamic between labor and capital.
Okay, the critic says, but capitalism inevitably leads to monopolies that crush small businesses and fix prices.
And the defender points to antitrust laws. A healthy capitalist system requires competition. If a company gets too big and starts suffocating the market, the state steps in and mechanically breaks that monopoly into smaller pieces, forcing them to compete again. The referee steps in to save the game from itself.
What about the fact that capitalism leaves the vulnerable to freeze or starve because they lack purchasing power?
The institutional answer is the welfare state, a strong social safety net. You use the incredible wealth generated by the capitalist engine to fund unemployment insurance, disability benefits, and food assistance, ensuring no one falls below that basic moral floor.
And what about the unequal starting line? The fact that rich kids inherit huge advantages.
You level the playing field by removing certain essential goods from the pure market dynamic. You provide high-quality public education funded by progressive taxation. You provide universal health care. You ensure that a child's access to health and knowledge doesn't depend on their parents' bank account.
And finally, what about political capture? The oligarchy problem, where wealth buys the laws.
You fix that with strict campaign finance reform. You build a legal firewall between economic wealth and political power so that one person equals one vote, not $1 equals one vote.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I'm looking at this list of solutions: labor unions, antitrust breakups, welfare nets, public education, campaign finance reform. The great paradox here is that the strongest defense of capitalism requires admitting that capitalism needs a massive framework of non-capitalist rules to actually be just. The defender is essentially saying that for capitalism to be just, it has to be surrounded, constrained, and heavily managed.
That is the profound irony at the heart of the institutional defense. Pure, unrestrained hypercapitalism is toxic to justice. But a properly governed capitalist market, one that is harnessed, taxed, and regulated by democratic institutions, is the greatest engine for human flourishing we have ever discovered. It generates the wealth needed to actually pay for the justice the critics want.
Which leads us perfectly into the final balanced synthesis of our deep dive today. After exploring the structural mechanics, the powerful defenses, the devastating philosophical critiques, and the institutional solutions, where do we land on the core question for you, the learner? Is capitalism compatible with justice?
The source material arrives at a deeply nuanced, balanced conclusion. The answer is that capitalism is neither inherently just nor inherently unjust. It is an incredibly potent mechanism, a tool.
A tool that can build a hospital or level a forest.
Yes. It can support justice in profound ways. It encourages decentralized innovation. It is highly flexible. It generates massive material abundance that can lift populations out of misery. And it fundamentally honors the freedom of individuals to make their own economic choices.
But left unchecked and unguided, its natural mechanical tendencies run directly counter to justice. It mathematically concentrates wealth, it commodifies human dignity, it creates profound economic insecurity for the vulnerable, and it relentlessly tries to convert its economic power into political domination.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical question of political economy. Is capitalism sovereign, or is justice sovereign?
Let me make sure I understand the distinction. If capitalism is sovereign, it means the market is the ultimate authority. The market dictates our societal values, it decides who gets what based on purchasing power, and society just has to adapt to whatever reality the market spits out.
Exactly. But if justice is sovereign, the relationship is inverted. It means we, as a democratic society, decide what our moral values are first. We decide what the baseline of human dignity looks like. And then we force the market to operate strictly within those boundaries.
So for capitalism to be compatible with a broader justice, like fair opportunity, non-domination, and meeting basic needs, it must be put on a leash. It must be politically constrained and morally limited. We have to build institutions that explicitly prioritize human dignity over the maximization of profit.
That is the ultimate conclusion drawn from synthesizing the text. A just society can absolutely use capitalism. It can, and probably should, harness its incredible productive power to generate wealth and drive innovation. But a just society must never worship it.
It must never worship it. That is a profound place to land. And we want to thank you for joining us on this really complex, winding journey today. We set out at the beginning to avoid easy, partisan answers, and I think exploring those four overlapping, often conflicting lenses of justice proves exactly why the easy answers are usually incomplete.
The objective was to provide clarity on the underlying architecture of these arguments, to show why intelligent, well-meaning people can look at the exact same economic system and disagree so passionately about its moral worth.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, we want to leave you with a few provocative questions straight from the text. These aren't questions we expect you to answer right now. They are concepts for you to mull over long after the audio stops, to examine in your own daily life, your own workplace, and your own community. Think about the power dynamics in your life and ask yourself, when does economic freedom become economic domination?
Consider the boundaries of the market. Which parts of life should never be left to the market alone?
And ultimately, when you look objectively at the society around you, do you think capitalism mainly rewards contribution? Or does it mainly protect those who already have capital?
We will leave you with this final, overarching thought from the text to carry with you. The real question is not capitalism or justice, but can markets serve justice, or will justice always have to protect us from what markets would otherwise do?
Something to think deeply about. Until next time, keep diving deep.